say that, so I just moved from San Francisco, and I thank you for welcoming me with this rainy weather. And, but it is fitting for some of the texts we will talk about today. So just as perplexing as you might think it is for such a safe country as Sweden and the neighboring countries, Norway and Denmark, to have such gory literature, as Kai Swanson said, or crime fiction, you might find it as puzzling why a little Latino boy is talking to you about Swedish literature. Well, here I am, and I just really like crime fiction, but of course it goes farther back than that. We have Swedish crime fiction, and the reason why I decided not to, other than that I speak Swedish, is I didn't want to focus on Scandinavian fiction, is because when you're in Scandinavia, you don't really consider yourself Scandinavian, I think. You consider yourself either Norwegian, Danish, or Swedish. And so today I wanted to talk to you about the Swedish authors, such as Stieg Larsson, and Henning Mankell, and Camilla Läckberg. So today I'll give you some background information, as well as talking about the history of crime fiction in Scandinavia, which goes farther back than we may think. And then we'll talk about some of the issues that the texts talk about today. So I'll start with just some current information. So with Swedish crime fiction, we have what we call the Stieg Larsson phenomenon. Who's read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo? Okay, yes. And so it's funny because in my first term teaching at Augustana, I asked my students who's taking Swedish because of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Half the students said yes, half of that, like a number of them had heritage, of course, but then some people, because of the American remake, had no idea that The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo was originally Swedish. So adaptations and remakes, especially in America, can make us forget where the originals come from. But hopefully, after one term of Swedish, my students can now read the novel in the original. Well, no, they can't, but yeah, but they definitely know about it. So with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which was originally published in 2005, and the translation came out by Reg Keelan in 2008. And this is part of the trilogy, the Millennium Trilogy, which has sold over 65 million copies in 40 countries. That is, of course, expanding by the day. And maybe even more important today, Larsson's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo was the first book to sell 1 million ebooks, or he's the first author to sell 1 million ebooks on Amazon. And I can say that I have, because these books are so thick, if you can't take them out to a beach if you have a beach nearby, it does help to have a PDF or that on a Kindle. So, and then Larsson, of course, is the breakthrough author. Of course, he has passed, but we do have another successful Swedish author, and that's Henning Mankell, and he is the author of the Wallander series. Who's read any Wallander novels? Okay, great. So so he has a series of those which has ended, and those have sold around 30 million copies in 40 countries. And in my classes, I do teach with these translations. I do want to say that the Larsson novels are so large and are so long that the students do prefer to watch the films instead. Yeah. So I want to go a little bit back farther before Larsson and talk about a series of novels by a team of writers, Mier-Cruz and Per. And they are the authors of the Martin Beck series. And, don't know what happened, sorry. Okay, hopefully it's still working. So they are the authors of the Martin Beck series, and that has been translated into many languages. And Mier-Cruz and Per, they began to look at society in Sweden through the lens of crime fiction. They were able to, distract us with a murder here, or like a series of murders on a bus. But also, while they were doing that, they were critiquing society in Sweden. Whereas, as here in America, we may be very familiar with the idea that Sweden is this perfect society, that they're this, all blonde hair, blue eyes, no crying, the welfare state and everything. But Swedes, they do, especially with Mier-Cruz and Valu in their literature, they were able to get down to the nitty-gritty and show that Sweden was not this utopian society that others from the outside have understood it to be. So I have here that Mier-Cruz and Valu, they use crime, the novel, as a scalpel, cutting open the belly of the ideologically pauperized and morally debatable so-called welfare state of the bourgeois type. And so they did that very well from the very, very left-wing politics. They were able to, through this series, explain the problems of Sweden, and also this was before some of the assassinations took place in Sweden's government, that they were showing that all is not right in this land. And so just here is an example of the Martin Beck series. The whole series was called The Story of a Crime, and each title had the subtitle Report of a Crime. And to get us into the mood of crime fiction, has anyone read the Frieze Lecture novel? Okay, a little bit less than the others. So I'm just going to read a paragraph or two from one of their novels called The Laughing Policeman. Den skrattande polisen, and this came out in 1968. And this is from the first chapter, and so I'll just read what kind of, this isn't their first novel, of course, but what could see as like the start of crime fiction, modern crime fiction in Scandinavia. So I'll begin. "I like the rain," Kohlberg said, climbing into his dark blue coat. "Isn't it enough for me to have a cold?" Martin Beck said. Martin Beck and Kohlberg were policemen. They belonged to the homicide squad. For the moment, they had nothing special to do and could, with relatively clear consciences, consider themselves free. Downtown, no policemen were to be seen in the streets. The old lady outside the central station waited in vain for a patrolman to come up to her, salute, and smilingly help her across the street. A person who had just smashed the glass of a showcase with a brick had no need to worry that the rising and falling wail from a patrol car would suddenly interrupt his doings. The police were busy. A week earlier, the police commissioner had said in a public statement that many of the regular duties of the police would have to be neglected because they were obliged to protect the American ambassador against letters and other things from people who disliked Lyndon Johnson and the war in Vietnam. Detective Inspector Lennart Kohlberg didn't like Lyndon Johnson and the war in Vietnam either, but he did like strolling about the city when it was raining. At 11 o'clock in the evening, it was still raining, and it's still raining, and the demonstration could be regarded as broken up. At the same time, 8 murders and 1 attempted murder were committed in Stockholm. So that was the very last paragraph of the introduction of The Laughing Policeman, and it really does set the tone for the rest of the novel and a lot of crime fiction in general. So we have comments on the weather, comments on policemen who are often dejected and who are let down by this idea, or let down by this failed fantasy that they would be like the American detectives or British detectives that save lives and solve crimes. And here they're waiting to help a lady walk down the street. So with the Martin Beck series, we got a series of novels that did critique society, and they within a Marxist critique of the burgeoning welfare state that was happening in Sweden. And all of this, it may be no surprise, was happening with a series of murders. So the murders could be a metaphor for, excuse me?
Who's the author?
Mier-Cruz and Valu. Mier-Cruz and Valu, it's a writing duo. And this is them, the couple here.
I can't write fast enough.
I'm sorry. Yeah. And this was becoming, Scandinavian crime fiction was becoming more accessible as the literature was embracing more more global problems. So we have globalization, capitalism, and this was something that the authors of the time were critiquing. Can I move this one? Yeah, okay. And so that was in the 60s, but has anyone read an Icelandic saga? Well, Berkeley forced me to learn Old Icelandic and kind of read the manuscripts with the dictionary. This is one of them, the saga of Gisli the Outlaw. And that's from the 1200s AD, of course. And so this is much earlier, obviously, than Pruvall and Valur. And I am not introducing this idea. However, the sagas were all about murder and pride and revenge, but also about honor. And the saga of Gisli, or Gisli saga, very long story, so I will be audacious enough to summarize the saga. But basically, so they have these relatives, kinships, almost like tribes where people they honor their group of family. And so there were two women who were gossiping, and it's a very sexist image even back then, but they were gossiping, and then one of the men heard that there was an affair. All of this led to murder. Now in Iceland, or like during the sagas, you can murder people, but you had to announce it first, otherwise you were outlawed. So as long as you just told somebody, I'm going to murder him, I'm going to get him with my axe, that was okay as long as you announced it. But then, because then it could set up a very honorable series of revenge killings. However, if you didn't announce it, you were outlawed, and then you would have no protection, no kinships could protect you. So you had to leave the Nordic countries and fend for yourself. I bring this up because this could be said to be one of the earliest crime fiction stories in Scandinavia. It's all about revenge, but there's this process of a crime being committed, this murder, and then these families for years set out to seek justice. And this is like a very ancient or vision of our system, various law systems. So going back, so I just wanted to go back to the Icelandic sagas first as something to think about. We had, even though Mier-Cruz and Pevalu were writing, we had the breakthrough, Sweden had its breakthrough with Henning Mankell. And Henning Mankell is one of Sweden's most successful writers, and until Stieg Larsson was the best-selling author. He had a very large following, especially in Germany. And it's interesting because before I even learned Swedish, I was in Germany and I wanted to work on my German, so the family I was staying with, they gave me this novel. And it was the White Lioness, excuse me, and I had no idea that it was a Swedish author. I was reading it in German, and so I think that just speaks to like the wild popularity, like even back then in the 90s, 2000s, that Scandinavian crime fiction was people were demanding it, and so in Germany and France, Henning Mankell was very successful. And so here he has this Wallander series, and this series, not only has it been translated, all of his, the novel's been translated, he has had 3 versions of this filmed. So there is 2 Swedish versions, and then there is a very recent British version starring Kenneth Branagh. And the Swedish versions, they're very close adaptations. However, the British version did, of course, have all the characters speaking English, although set in Sweden. So Kurt Wallander series is very dear to many people's hearts, and it was very sad to see him go with the last one in 2009, Den oroliga mannen, which was published in Britain and America in 2011. And Kurt Wallander is a very I wouldn't want to say a typical Scandinavian man, but he is a typical, because of him, typical police detective in Sweden. And that means unhappy, has a very dysfunctional family, sexually frustrated. He is divorced. In the first novel, he does, and it was Mördare utan ansikte, Faceless Killers translation. He's in the middle of a divorce, he has been divorced, excuse me, and he finds a new love interest, only to try too hard and drink too much, and he kind of squanders that chance. He has, in the beginning, he has a very strained relationship with his daughter, who is a very independent young woman, who is also in the first novel dating a black man. And so Henning Mankell used Wallander in the beginning to show some things that were very close to his own life, because Henning Mankell had done a lot of work in Africa, and he was very concerned, with other ethnicities and how they were treated in Sweden. And so Mördare utan ansikte deals largely with a growing fear in southern Sweden of the immigrants and the asylum seekers in Sweden. And that is something that book written in the early 90s, published in the early 90s, it's very contemporary in terms of its thematic context, looking at the problems and the fears of racism and prejudice in Sweden. So I would like to read a little bit from the first introduction of the Wallander series, Mördare utan ansikte, and I'll read this in the Murray translation. So here's the setting. It is very cold. It is the winter. It is snowing, of course. And then we have a man, an elderly man, who was awoken. He was having bad dreams. And something wasn't right, so he goes to his neighbor's house. He trudges through the snow. And so I'll begin. I am just imagining things, he thinks. I'm an old man who can't figure out what's really happening anymore. Maybe I did dream about the bulls last night. The bulls that I would dream were charging towards me when I was a boy, making me realize that someday I would die. Then he hears the cry. It's weak, more like a moan. It's Maria. He goes over to the bedroom and peeks cautiously through the gap between the curtain and the window frame. Suddenly, he knows that Johannes is dead. He shines his torch inside and blinks hard before he forces himself to look. Maria is crumpled up on the floor, tied to a chair. Her face is bloody, and her false teeth lie broken on her spatted nightgown. All he can see of Johannes is a foot. The rest of his body is hidden by the curtain. He limps back and climbs over the fence again. His knee aches as he stumbles desperately across the frozen mud. First he calls the police. Then he takes his crowbar from a closet that smells of mothballs. Wait here, he tells Hannah. You don't need to see this. What happened? She asks with tears of fright in her eyes. I don't know, he says, but I woke up because the mare wasn't neighing in the night. I know that for sure. It is the 7th of January, 1990, not yet dawn. So here we see in the first chapter, again, there's been a death, and he finds his neighbors, his best friends, viciously beaten. Fortunately, without spoiling anything, the wife, Maria, is found alive, and so they work desperately trying to not only save her life, but also get some clues. And one of the clues that she says sounds like something, but they don't know what. And then it is, what she says is something that was foreign. And this leads the police detectives to look for the immigrants, to look for the ones that are also in this text, the victims of racist crimes. And so while this text shows us the fears that some of the Swedes have in the local southern towns in Skåne, that they have, and then the right side, the neo-Nazis, that they have in Sweden. He also shows that the police detectives themselves, even though they were trying to do good and solve these crimes, were also looking for the wrong people. We're looking for these immigrants. They were trying to save them as well as trying to punish them. And so without giving away what happens in that story, we have Kurt Wallander, who solves his crime, but he's still not happy. Things aren't sunshine, there's no sunshine and roses. And we're left with, wow, what is next? And we know, well, we have a lot of crime to follow. And so this is something that is, we almost don't get happy endings with crime fiction. And I'd like to ask later what you think of that. So most of you have read crime fiction. What leads you to reading more? Actually, I'll ask that right now. What leads you to write, to read more when you know death and violence will follow? Any comments? Okay.
The puzzle of trying to figure out who did it and why.
Okay, yeah. So it's going back to the classic who done it and why. Yes. And do you often feel satisfied once you?
Not really.
Okay. Yes. And so we have this. Like sometimes we will get that satisfaction if, oh yes, I was right. But usually, and this is something that, traditional in crime fiction, detective fiction, where you have the whodunit, you have the locked door mystery. I like to teach the Scandinavian crime fiction in conjunction with Edgar Allan Poe's Murder in the Rue Morgue, where you have this, one of the first locked door mysteries, where you have unfortunately the victims are women yet again, but an older woman is bludgeoned to death, and her daughter has been stuffed up a chimney, and so gruesome stuff, but it seems impossible. And so the detective, Dupont, he doesn't know, okay, no one came in, no one came out, how can we do this? And so some of the Scandinavian fiction does speak to this, because you have authors who write primarily on the island of Gotland, for example. And so that, in a way, is a kind of locked door, okay, only people on this island could have committed it. But then, if you think about it, so for Kurt Wallander, looking at these streets or these fields in Skåne, only some of these people, some of these farmers, one of them could have done it. And if not them, then an immigrant. And so we have this chase, and it's and sometimes that chase leads us to question, okay, who are we looking for? Who is capable of murder? And the more crime fiction you read, the more I think you read these authors, not to speak for all of them as if they speak for have one voice, but they have a terrifying message that the people who murder are sometimes the everyday people who murder out of desperation or have secrets. So on that note, who else reads further? Sorry.
I want to talk about genres.
Yeah.
You want to look at the millions and billions of dollars that are spent in movie theaters, from westerns to war movies to crime and suspense movies, or on TV programs like that. As long as it's on the page or on the screen, it's obviously a fantastically popular interest.
Yes, and then I'm glad you brought up that kind of aesthetic distance, or this distance of it's on the screen. And so even as gruesome as these texts can be, there's something to say oh, this is just on the page, but not even that, oh, it's in Sweden, a faraway country, and what has been in America largely romanticized as this utopian. But then that also gets turned around, because if Sweden is no longer this utopian society for us, then who is safe, right? And so so it's one thing to read Scandinavian fiction abroad, but to be reading it in Sweden, on the train, everyone's reading it. It is this very chilling effect of being far away, but also very close. And I'm very into crime fiction, or just crime in general. In fact, this is it's kind of funny, because my mom, who I'm glad she did this. She just passed away 2 weeks ago, but she told me that when I was when I was still inside her, I don't know why, but she had these cravings to read like true crime. And so, so she read these things, and then luckily I came out in analyzing it, not committing it. But so she and so I grew up with like a lot of Alfred Hitchcock, and then I got into Patricia Highsmith, an American author. And her novels are very interesting because her protagonists are not so much anti-heroes, but we make them into anti-heroes because, I won't segue too far off, but like a lot of her protagonists are the murderers, the killers, and you sympathize with them. So her most famous protagonist is, or antagonist, Tom Ripley in her Ripley series, and that goes on for 5 books of this man killing. Not to spoil, but there are 5 books, and this is something that we don't get too much of in Scandinavian, but we do. There is the writing team Rothman and Hellström. Hellström is a convicted criminal, this author, and he has teamed up with someone who was a journalist and who was also a police officer, and they would co-write these texts and like looking at, you know, the murderer's point of view or the criminal's point of view, and then also, you know, the detectives. And then Håkan Nessa also has us sympathize with his killers. Not to say, you know, that he's not like saying murder is black or white, and that is a long-running tradition in Scandinavian or Swedish crime fiction. There is a large liminal space of what is good, what is evil, and as you mentioned, why people kill. Sometimes it is very, I won't say which text, it's a little depressing because when you get to the why, it doesn't feel like that why exists. Sometimes someone just killed for no reason, killed for a very meaningless reason. But then there are some, you know, who are trying to cover grave secrets. So there's that. Who else is it?
Sex and death are the great themes, I think, of Freud and others. And the crime novels usually cover one or both of those. Often sex is often.
Yes, yes.
The theme of sex are often the reason for the murder, that greed.
Yes, death and greed.
Sex and greed are
Yes. And so since you brought up sex, let's, so as we know, so let's look at Stieg Larsson. Keep in mind we've been dealing with the exception of Mier-Cruz, we've been looking at male authors, but I will get to the female authors. But we have Stieg Larsson, and the original title, so we have the English translation, is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and of course most of us know that the original title is Män som hatar kvinnor. Here we have it, that was published in 2005. And then so Men Who Hate Women, and for those who have read this, we know that this text has introduced an incredibly popular and also interesting character, Lisbeth Salander, this picture right here of her, who is this she's this super sleuth, but she's also a criminal, she's a hacker. She's very androgynous. She likes to be outside of mainstream and status quo in her outward appearance, and also in her sexuality. She, without putting labels, she does have lesbian relationships, but also heterosexual relationships. And we have her being written by a male author, Stieg Larsson. And I guess I don't need to describe too much of this because you guys are familiar with the novels, with these texts. But you have this woman who's teamed up with this man, and horrible, horrible things happen to women throughout this. Not only Lisbeth Salander, there's too much rape, and a lot of female victims. Also, that includes rape. This is something that is perplexing some contemporary academics of this genre and also these texts specifically. So we can ask whether Stieg Larsson did or has, through his Millennium series, the 3 are called the Millennium series, whether he has constructed a very a feminist or an empowering an empowering subjectivity for women. Because you have Lisbeth Salander, who is so incredibly strong, and she is not like a lot of the previous characters in Swedish fiction. But at the same time, because of some of the androgynous play that Larsson has with her, making her somewhat masculine, intimidating, able to, capable of harming men, there's this kind of paradoxical notion here. Does the woman need to have traditionally and historically masculine traits to be strong, or why can't we escape from essentializing what is masculine and what is feminine? So here's where my feminism comes in. Can a woman just be a woman, but then what is a woman? That's surely not just femininity. So I'm not going to dare to answer that. But yes, but you do have, and so you could go through all of the novels, and so and this is someone who is very in charge of her sexuality, but at the same time she is not in charge because of the rape and the tragedies in the past. And unfortunately, some of this will just exist because we're looking at crime. We're looking at the darkness that is in humanity. We see that it exists. So, even if Larsson did want to, construct the ultimate perfect feminist, non-discriminating character in Lisbeth Salander, discrimination exists, sexism exists, and that's something that he had her face. So I do think, in terms of this novel or this series, what was in the past something, like secretaries were being inappropriately hit on by some of the sergeants, the women were always objects of these police detectives' affections. We see that trying to happen in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and then the rest of the series with Blomqvist, her partner, almost naturally falling into that, but then it stops because she is not that. She is not the traditional woman. I think, we'll get there. I think it is very important to read these stories by playing with that liminal space of what is good, what is evil, what is masculine, what is feminine. And unfortunately, when we have a character like Lisbeth Salander who embodies some of that masculine and feminine, we see that the crimes that increases crime. Not only is her crime that she's masculine or that she's androgynous, and that leads to crime. So like her guardian will not be intimidated her until later when she gets revenge, thank goodness, or not. We see that it challenges the men into committing these crimes, but at the same time, I wouldn't say her masculinity or femininity fought back. It was just who she was. She was this person who, for me, says it's okay to be in the middle. You don't need to be good or evil, because we do forget that she is a criminal because she is hacking. So what I find personally when I read these is I find that Swedish authors really kind of, I wouldn't say consciously construct this liminal space of being in this in-between, but they do have, it's almost like naturally, the detectives aren't superheroes, they're everyday men, what makes it seem like we could do a better job actually. And then there are these murderers who, with Håkan, we see, oh, they are not animals, there is some humanity there. And then we have this character, Lisbeth Salander, who has been raped, who does rape, and then who also is just a very strong female subject. And so I think Scandinavian or Swedish literature with this discussion really allows us to kind of play in that field of liminality. Not saying that, okay, this liminal space of the in-between is where we ought to be or where society ought to be, but that's where these characters are, and that seems to be reflected, in my opinion, throughout Swedish fiction. Okay, so now I will look at a female author. So we have Camilla Läckberg. So here is also the beginning of her first, I'm sorry, not her first novel, but this is from Isprinsessan, which was published in 2003. And this is from the very first, let's say, chapter, the very beginning. And so here it is in English. But I thought we could have some fun and hear some Swedish. So as this is up in English, sorry, we can have some Swedish. Sorry. Okay. Anyone want to read Swedish for us? Okay, you want to? I can read it. It would be fun to have the audience to kind of join us. We want to hear you read it. Okay, so here it is in English for those who don't know Swedish. So, huset var ödsligt och tomt. Kylan trängde in i alla vrår. En tunn hinna av is hade bildats i badkaret. Hon hade börjat anta en lätt blåaktig ton. Han tyckte att hon såg ut som en prinsessa där hon låg. En isprinsessa. Golvet han satt på var iskallt, men kylan bekymrade honom inte. Han sträckte ut handen och rörde vid henne. Blådet på hennes handleder hade för länge sedan stelnat. Kärleken till henne hade aldrig varit starkare. Han smekte hennes arm som om han smekte den själ som nu flytt kroppen. Han vände sig inte om när han gick. Det var inte adjö, utan på återseende. Wait, okay. So that is the very beginning of Camilla Läckberg's Isprinsessan. And actually, I had read this before, but when I was asked to do this, I turned to this novel because in my classes I've taught so many male authors, with the exception of my Frufag. I really wanted to return to this because this story follows Erika Farik, and I wouldn't say it's in any way biographical or autobiographical, excuse me, because it is not Läckberg's life, but we do have someone who writes biographies who, it turns out, gets mixed up in this murder mystery. What happens is Erika Farik, she had a childhood friend who kind of left her, moved away, and just didn't come back. And so the protagonist, Erika, always felt like she did something wrong. And then one day she turns back, goes back home. She's been living in Gothenburg. She goes back home, and someone calls to her, and someone very frantic, and has her come in and go into another house. And she goes into the house, and then as we see the aftermath of what this Isprinsessa, we see her on the ground, and it appears that she committed suicide. And so she gets tied up into this murder mystery, mostly because the mother of the deceased really needs someone to be there, and she holds on to these old childhood memories. But also, she's also asked to write kind of, not an obituary, but yeah, something like an obituary for the deceased, her friend. And as she's interviewing people, then she realizes things are not as they should, something is wrong. And she meets the husband of the deceased, and then she meets the friends, and then so she gets taken along on this mystery. But what I noticed with Läckberg, I don't really like to say, okay, how does a man write and how does a woman write, because I just spent 4 years writing my dissertation about that. But I did notice that there was a sense of honesty with her character, Erika Falk. There were some detectives in other novels who say, oh yeah, I'm gonna go on a diet, and then they never do. They're like going through the drive-through all the time, or like, oh yes, they put blame on others when a suspect cannot be questioned or things like that. But her protagonist, this writer of biographies, she kind of says, yeah, I don't know what to write, and this could be some good fuel. And so there's kind of self-reflexivity in this novel. You have this raw author who gets caught up in this mystery, and it becomes this kind of, it becomes fuel for her, and she does want to help solve the murder, but she also knows that she can somehow benefit from it. But she seems very honest about that, but it's not sensationalized in any way. And so this is something that, if you're looking for a kind of different protagonist, I would definitely recommend reading more Läckberg's writing. Okay. Wait, how much time? I'm sorry, 10 more? Okay. And so, yeah, so I think that Swedish crime fiction, the reason it has been so widespread, I don't think I can personally answer that, but I do think it has to do with some kind of this distance, but also this closeness, because Sweden is, through its crime fiction, is revealed to be no longer this utopia, this perfect country of supermodels and smorgasbords, although yes, exist. We see that political situations and even deadly political associations, such as the assassination of Olof Palme and Anna Lindh, not for the Swedes, like, even though they knew that this bubble didn't exist, it still popped that non-existent bubble. Yes, death happens, crime happens, and we are not safe. And then there are other, like, these serial killers, or deaths like Lestemannen, and these novels were kind of a way to, I think, calm the Swedish reading public and knowing, okay, once it's on the text, it's no longer real. The murders are no longer real. They do, of course, have a very low crime rate, thank goodness. But these novels can kind of dig up that evil, can dig up that violence, and to say, okay, if we dig that up, then maybe our societal problems, our political problems, are not that bad, but we can kind of come together to fix them. And then it's not like in some kind of social democratic way, but just in a very human way. And I think crime fiction, Swedish crime fiction, no matter how gory it is, it does give some kind of a sense of hope, I think, for the Swedes who are reading it, like on the train, but also for those abroad who can get mixed up in the fantastical, the gruesome, the horror, and after all of that, be involved in a very kind of complex, going through this puzzle, this mystery, using your mind, and finding a glimmer of hope beneath all of that. With Mier-Cruz, Wallander, their Laughing Policeman series, go back to them. Without saying which book it is, after you read throughout the whole novel, Martin Beck, he finds out that the answer was there all along, was written on a note on a desk on one of the officers. So without saying which book that was, you go through this whole novel, you know, who was the killer, this person, interview after interview, and all along it was the suspect was there on the desk. No one just bothered to clean it up. So I think that is a good just like example of kind of like the feeling you get with Swedish crime fiction. You're taking on this very thrilling ride, but it's not too sensational. It's very realistic, frightfully realistic, but there is some kind of hope in humanity. But it doesn't ignore the darkness that's in our world. And I think it allows us to communicate with that darkness in a way that is, I wouldn't say good, but maybe healthy, maybe not healthy. My mom was the one reading about death when I wasn't even born, so I don't know, I'm maybe not the best person to comment on that. But it does speak to something that is very universal, because we have, you know, politics and globalization and capitalism, you know, and in 2006 when, you know, the Social Democrats lost in Sweden to the more right wing, you have this reality that, you know, countries are becoming, they're more universal and people do not live in this bubble. And to leave on a kind of darker note, there is something that is even more universal, and that is fear. And I think these novels help us work through that fear and maybe say, oh, it's going to happen to somebody else or nobody else. And this is something that I found, this next quotation that I would read, and it's not from crime fiction, but it's something that when I was reading it, I had translated this novel by Stieg Larsson, a Swedish author, and this is not a crime fiction novel. But when I read this paragraph, I thought, this is what I feel in life, but also crime fiction. And I think this speaks to something that we all have within us. So he writes, within us, we all carry an image of something dreadful that will happen to us one day when it's very dark. An image of someone we will meet one night when it's very rainy and stormy. An image of someone waiting behind a door for us when we enter a dark room someday. We all carry an image of a ghost within us. And this is why we are never truly afraid of that dreadful encounter, because every time it gets dark, we are already expecting it. A sensation of confirmation mingled with terror is all that we feel. So I got chills when I read that, but I also thought that this really does it kind of explains the space that we are in when we read crime fiction. We can learn about society, we learn about ourselves, psychology. There are some authors who write more about psychology and they do not want to teach us about Sweden. But then there are some who just do. And so, yeah, I think we should just, I don't know, I think I'll leave that with Dagerman. This confirmation mingled with terror is all that we feel. So, yeah, that's all I have.